Hello everyone, and welcome to my casting tutorial. I'm Zambrella. This is episode number 4. Exciting stuff, and this time I'm going to follow on from episode 3, part of the Inform series, and this time it's going to be about the game, as opposed to the introduction draft, which you can see in episode 3. I'll put a link to that somewhere. So after our previous episode, you should now have a good understanding of how to introduce a game and go through the draft, if applicable for your game that you're casting. This episode will once again focus on informing your audience and spectators, but through the game section of a match. Also, like the previous episode, I think the best way to approach this one is to do it in a chronological order. So, here we go. Early game. As we know, the early game is all about the laning phase, and this should be the focus of your casting. However, before the game starts in earnest, I personally like to go through what player is playing which heroes. It helps not only you, but the audience get to know the names of the players. For example, you say Arteezy on the Naga Siren, or Sumail playing his Storm Spirit, something like that. And it's also a good time to almost reintroduce the game, to say, here we got game number 2 of, Team A versus Team B. And the next step after this is to identify what the lanes are going to be. Is it going to be a dual off lane, an aggro try, something like that? And talk about favourable lanes and matchups. I mean, normally this occurs in the mid lane, so you see, Storm Spirit doesn't do so well against Wind Ranger, something like that. If that is indeed true. And whenever I load into the game, the first thing I do, without a doubt, is to change the statistics in Dota, that's in the top left hand side, by pressing the W key to the last hits and denies, as pretty much all other statistics are pretty useless. You can see that in the picture on the right hand side there. It's also a great way for spectators and yourself to get a feel for how the early game is going without having to be in all lanes at once. But I think the major struggle with casting the early game is making sure to not just stick in one lane for too long, or to move between jump between the different lanes too quickly. And the thing is, the optimal time spent in each lane, it changes from game to game. For example, a try versus try lane is likely to demand much more attention than a static 1v1 lane. Common movements that you should definitely watch out for, though, is the mid laner or any jungler or something picking up a rune and moving to another lane, or more commonly I think is supports smoking up together and heading towards normally the mid lane or possibly another lane. So yeah, watching for early rotations. So mid game and team fights. The mid game, for Dota 2 anyway, generally starts around about the 10-minute mark. This is when the cores have got a base level of farm and might start rotating. At this point, I like to switch up the statistics from last hits and denies to show net worth. So this is kind of more all-encompassing, as although the carries may have the same number of last hits, or may have got a couple of kills during the lane, some tower gold, and this is reflected in net worth. I also I think it's worth showing the net worth and XP graphs at this stage of the game. Just gives you you and the audience, the spectators, a general feel of the game at this stage. It is likely as well during the mid game that team fights will take place. Possibly Roshan will be an objective and pushing as well. So it's your job as a caster to keep an eye out on these things and inform the spectators. So moving on to team fights, this is interesting, and I have one big tip casting team fights, and this is especially true of fractured or spread out team fights, is try not to cast everything at once. It will just confuse you. It's impossible to do pretty much, and confuse your spectators as well. So focus on a specific segment of the game, preferably the most important part, such as potential of cores dying, big team fights, RPs, black holes, that sort of stuff. Don't worry about the fact that one support like a Rubik is chasing after CM in the jungle somewhere else on the edge of the fight. That there's no point following all of those things. And after big team fights, make use of the fight recap option, or little button in the top middle in case of Dota 2 anyway, and identify significant spells and damage done. It could be really useful to recap what happened. For example, what made that team fight go so well? for the specific team. Any mistakes or big plays that happened that make the team fight work for the team that won and not work for the team that lost. I think that can be really important. Normally you'd see so like the play-by-play caster will do the play-by-play of the team fight, and then after the team fight is finished, the pro or the more analytical caster will come in and talk about what worked, what didn't work. But if you're casting on your own, you can do both. During downtime in games, that can happen quite a lot throughout the mid and late game. Sometimes a lot of it happens as well. It's worth talking about potential skill or item builds, what you like, what they could get that would work very well. And I think this is very important to discuss, but be careful. You don't want to spend your whole time discussing and theory crafting. This can get very tiresome. Also, don't forget to periodically show the XP and net worth graphs, because it just gives a really good indication of how the game's going. So moving on to now the late game and end game. So the late game is where things can get really interesting, especially as the structure of the game can start to break down, and thus casting can sometimes be a bit hard to direct. There can be long periods where very little happens, where teams both smoke and run into each other's jungle at the same time, or they face off against Roshan without actually fighting. And this is where I think the oops, sorry, I've knocked the mic again, how terrible. And this is where the entertain part of being a caster really comes in, and that's another lesson for another day, so do subscribe if you want to hear about that. But during the later stages of the game, buybacks become very important, and net worth and XP differences can make less of an impact, so switching the stats to buyback status can be very handy. Keep track of BKB time, BKB cooldowns, timings, how long is it, 5 seconds, 6 seconds, 10 seconds, and other important spell cooldowns as 5v5 fights become more commonplace. Quite often split pushing can also happen, so always keep an eye on the mini-map throughout, especially as split pushing is becoming quite common in this meta anyway. It can be, this can take time and practice, much like when you play the late game. You can practice, but only by actually playing in a late game scenario do you get better at it, and this is the same of casting. So once the game is finished, you're presented, the throne's fallen, the ancient, whatever it is. You're normally, at least in Dota anyway, you're presented with the end screen, with the kills and deaths and assists and XP, XPM, GPM, that sort of thing. It can be very tempting just to leave it there and be like, yeah, thanks very much, folks, and good night. But especially if it's been a long game, I do, however, think it's a very good idea to give a summary of the game, highlight turning points in the game, any team fights that were particularly important, any decisions, items that really made a difference. And don't forget, comment on any outstanding plays or players. Give your MVP. Do try to be positive. You don't want to be too negative. But that's pretty much it. Don't forget to mention any upcoming games. Tomorrow I'll be casting this game, or this was a best of 3. We'll be going to a game 3, something like that. And give yourself some credit. Tell everyone where they can follow you on Twitter, your website, YouTube, whatever. It's just a good way of summing it up. So that's it for this episode. Just a brief summary. In the early game, you focus on the lanes, identify the likely lanes where action should be, and make sure you got last hits and denies being shown. Then after 10 minutes, keep your eye out for team fights. Switch over to the net worth. It's also worth showing XP and net worth graphs over every so often when you think it's important. And for the late game, where things do start to break down, buybacks become very important, so keep an eye on those, as well as the Roshan timer. And finally, at the end game, make sure to highlight any big plays and game-changing events. Like I've said throughout the last couple of episodes, you're creating a story, and it's always nice when a story has an ending. Anyway, so next episode, we'll move from the informed section onto the entertain section, while hopefully, I will give you some tips on how to make your casting as entertaining as possible. So I hope you've enjoyed this so far. I'd appreciate any feedbacks, any comments you can leave. You can either tweet me at Zambrella101 or in the comment section below. I will respond to those. When I do stream, you can follow me on Twitch which is Zambrella101, and for more information, go to my website www.zambrella.com/casting. I hope you have a good one, and I'll see you in the next episode.